but Dave's recently retired from the Forest Service, where he worked for many years. So
41 years.
that's many. That would probably be almost your whole working career, wouldn't it?
Yep. Oops. I'm just trying to share my slides here. And how are those coming through?
Can you enlarge the screen a bit, David?
There we go. I'm going to move
Yeah,
people
thank
over
you.
here.
That's
Perfect.
fine.
All right. Good. Well, should I jump right into it, David?
I would say it's almost time, and a few
Okay.
minutes early probably won't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Much.
Well, thank you, David. It is really fun for me to talk to this group, partly because, believe it or not, I have a really deep connection with Minnesota Futurists that goes back to the early 1970s through my father. He was an executive and a market researcher and a member of the World Future Society back in the early 1970s. And as such, he participated for a while when I was in high school in Minnesota Futurists. I don't remember how frequently he attended, but I remember him on Saturday mornings occasionally going off to a meeting. And so that was one of my first exposures to futures. And also, as a member of the World Future Society, we got he received the Futurist magazine every 2 months, which when I was in high school, I would read that cover to cover. And eventually, when I was an undergraduate in the mid to late 70s, I put together an individually designed bachelor's degree in future studies based on what I had been exposed to in the Futurist magazine and talking to some other Minnesota futurists or hearing them talk, like Earl Joseph, who was the founder or one of the founders of Minnesota Futurists, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I heard Earl speak on campus once, and Joel Barker, and who was the guy in the there was a professor,
Art Harkin.
Art Harkins, who also, so there were all these Minnesota futurists that had an influence on my early thinking in that area. In the chat, I posted a link to this website. This is my personal website. And in case you're interested in looking at some of the publications, up at the top there, you can see the various tabs, and there are links to all of my futures publications if you go to that link some other time. But you've got the link to the website in the chat area if you want to look at that later. The title of my talk is Wildcards, High Impact Surprises That Shape the Future. And by that, I don't mean to imply that wildcards are the only thing, the only factor or force that's shaping the future, because there are many, but they are an important force, I think. And I mentioned earlier that my talk today is based on this paper. It was published in an environmental law review called the Natural Resources Journal. And there's also a link to this publication if you're interested in it in my publications, or I'm happy to send you a PDF of it as well. The principle that all of this today is based on is that the future is wild. I've been working on a book recently, the past almost a year now, on principles for thinking about the future and strategies for developing foresight. It's going to be one of these books with many short chapters. One of the short chapters is this principle that the future is wild, which focuses on wildcards and their importance in our thinking about the future. So here's what I'd like to cover. First, talk a little about what are wildcards, define them, characterize them a bit, distinguish 3 different types of wildcards, and talk about those a little bit. What are some strategies for dealing with potential wild cards? And then a very brief concluding thought. All right, so what are wild cards? I just want to pause and say, it would be helpful if we hold the questions till the end. Is that okay? I know maybe that's not the norm for this group, but there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So wild cards, the term is used in a lot of different contexts. It's used in sports. Apparently, I'm not a sports guy, but people tell me that it's used in sports. People can be wild cards, unpredictable, disruptive. I have a brother who's a bit of a wild card, in fact. Card games, obviously the Joker, and in computer programming. So there are all these different ways the term is used, but it's all about disruption, really, if you look at the theme across of those. In future studies, in strategic foresight, wild cards are defined as low probability, high impact events that often unfold rapidly and are highly disruptive and can shape the future. That's the best characterization that I can give them. They can arise in any domain, social, technological. We've had a lot of political wild cards in the US recently and elsewhere. And at any scale, we experience wild card events at the individual personal level, and it can be a positive thing like winning the lottery, I wish, or it might be something devastating like a terrible health diagnosis, which we're all familiar with those types of events. Wild cards can be positive or negative. In fact, a big wild card always has positive and negative effects, and they have cascading direct and indirect impacts as well. The really big wild cards can shift entire systems and change paradigms. Wildcards have been studied in many different fields, not just by futurists, but all kinds of fields. And there are many different terms for them: strategic surprises, discontinuities, extreme events, black swans, unknown unknowns. Do you remember when, I think it was back during the George W. Bush administration, Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, we might call him now, but he was the Secretary of Defense, and he used this term unknown unknowns in a speech or talking to reporters or something, and he was derided and mocked a bit for that. But if you're the Secretary of Defense and you're not thinking about the unknown unknowns that could affect our future, you're not doing your job well. If wild cards are so rare, if they're low probability events, do we really need to worry about them? And the answer is yes, partly because of the research by these guys and many others, Kahneman and Tversky, but others as well. There's been a lot of research that shows that although individual wild cards are rare, collectively, as a class of event, they are by no means rare. They are very, very common. And people consistently underestimate the number, frequency, and impacts of wild cards. So if ignoring them is not a good strategy, it's not a good strategy personally for the way you manage your life and plan your life. It's not a good strategy for organizations or for entire societies and countries. And speaking of individual wild cards, Daniel Kahneman, despite not being an economist, won the Nobel Prize in Economics back in 2002. This has happened 2 or 3 times over the years, where a social scientist in another field has been given the Nobel Prize in Economics because their work has so much relevance and has had such an impact on economic thinking. In future studies, this man, Herman Kahn, was really the beginning of such a important figure in the early history of future studies and futures thinking, at least in the United States, and his wild card thinking about nuclear war, including a couple of books, Thinking the Unthinkable and On Thermonuclear War. This was really thinking about a particular very, very important wild card that that he focused on. Really an interesting character. I've been meaning to, there's a fairly recent biography of Herman Kahn that I've been meaning to read and haven't gotten around to ordering it yet. Do you know the title of that, anyone? Okay. So that's a little brief introduction to wild cards. And now to get a little more deep, I like to distinguish these three types of wild cards: in plain sight, on the horizon, and over the horizon. I think these are categorically distinct. The categories are based on the ability for the event to be detected in advance. And that, to me, that's really the key thing to think about is, can we see it coming? Because the strategies for dealing with them are a lot different depending on if you can see it coming or not. And so starting with the in plain sight wild card, they can be detected in advance, although we may not know a lot about the timing or the geographic extent of the wild card, things like that. But the experts in relevant fields really can see them coming because similar events have occurred in the past. They know this. There may be early warning signals that say, hey, this possibility of this event unfolding is increasing or is about to happen. And of course, the pandemic, we were talking about this earlier, but the recent pandemic that we all lived through is a great example of this type of wild card in plain sight, because the experts, the public health officials, the virologists, the epidemiologists knew that it was not if, but when a global pandemic would happen. And one of the prime people related to that was Professor Michael Osterholm at the University of Minnesota. On the right there, his book from 2017, before the pandemic. On the left, the big one is his most recent book, which I think just came out last year, maybe last fall. He's been warning about the importance of being prepared for global pandemics for most of his career. And you've probably heard him on public radio or read about him in the media and heard interviews with him. The impacts of the pandemic were widespread, and they are ongoing. We were chatting a little bit about this earlier, that in so many areas, I've just listed a few here, that we see the impact of that wild card event. Just because it's detectable in advance, it's an on the horizon, or sorry, in plain sight wild card, doesn't mean that it doesn't have huge impacts. So here's another example of a wild card, an economic wild card: hyperinflation. This occurs during periods of great economic disruption or a depression, and it happens basically when a government makes a very foolish decision to print massive amounts of money to pay for its spending, rather than do things like sell bonds or raise taxes or cut spending. And so they keep printing more and more money, and the balance, the money supply gets way out of whack, out of balance from the rest of the economy. And what happens is that you get hyperinflation. And it's been studied by economists for a long time, so the experts are well aware of this phenomenon. This 1956 paper by Kagan defined hyperinflation as a monthly inflation rate of at least 50%, which translates to an annual rate of almost 13,000%, if you can imagine that. Americans get nervous when the inflation rate starts to edge up towards double digits, towards 9, 10, 11%. We get very nervous. This is 13,000% annual rate. Economists have found there have been 30 hyperinflationary episodes in various countries around the world, going way back a ways in history. Probably were some before that, I don't know. And the impacts, of course, of hyperinflation are absolutely devastating to an economy and to the people living in that economy. It's actually good. I mentioned earlier that even negative wildcards have positive effects. If you're in debt, you can pay off your debt with worthless dollars if there's hyperinflation. And so I mentioned this to the students in my class that if they have student debt, if we had hyperinflation, they would be in good shape. They could pay it off quickly. In Hungary, after World War II, was the most severe hyperinflation episode in history that is known. They actually printed and distributed 100 quintillion pengo banknotes. That's a 1 followed by 20 zeros. So they didn't even put all the zeros on this bill. They actually printed but never distributed a 1 sextillion note.
Huh.
Things collapsed before they had to do that. But in the photo at the bottom there, you can see the German woman burning using the banknotes. This was one of the things, the devastating hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s was one of the things that led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in the 30s. Here's another example of an in plain sight wildcard that some of you are probably familiar with, but interspecies communication facilitated by artificial intelligence and other advanced communication technologies. There are teams of interdisciplinary teams of scientists around the world in a number of different teams working on interspecies communication. And it could really be a game changer in a number of ways. I've listed couple positive consequences in terms of wildlife management and conservation. It could transform people's attitudes towards animals and towards the entire natural world. We're not going to be holding conversations like Dr. Dolittle with animals, but we would understand them in a really much deeper way if we could tap into that. And there are climate benefits. Who's going to want to eat their friend animal that they can communicate with so easily? And there are also ethical concerns with this. So the implications, the cascading implications of this kind of wild card are pretty great. This is another example, and I know this is one that is of interest to a number of people in Minnesota Futurists, and so you know much more about this than I do, but the radical life extension is another in plain sight wild card because there are, again, many teams of interdisciplinary scientists working on it, and it's well-financed work. A lot of people are interested, but I find that there are a lot of people who have never heard of this. In fact, I mentioned it to a friend of mine a few months ago, and he laughed because he assumed I was joking at the idea of radical life extension. And I just put one implication here. It's one that maybe as an environmental social scientist, I'm most interested in. But if radical life extension ends up being very expensive, at least at first, and if only the rich and the super rich could afford it, they already have massive carbon footprints, and that would just be extended. Just a thought. We could spend all day talking about the direct, indirect, positive, and negative implications of radical life extension. It's a really interesting example. here's a possible future in plain sight wild card. And again, this was brought up earlier in our discussion. I like before I started the formal presentation, and I like the way it all ties together here. But there are various climate tipping points and the possibility of abrupt climate change. We're all used to this gradual climate change. It's really not that gradual, what we've been experiencing in recent decades. In geological terms, in terms of the history of our climate, it's very rapid, but it seems gradual to us because it's not super abrupt. But there's the possibility of much more abrupt climate change, and climopaleontologists know that the Earth's climate has changed abruptly many times. By looking at those ice cores that, Dean, were you the one that brought that up? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the ice cores, I heard a talk by Richard Alley, who's a paleoclimatologist, and it's a YouTube that's available. I'll post that later. But he published a book called The 2-Mile Time Machine, because these ice cores can be as long as 2 miles when you connect them all together, and going back 2 to 3 million years. So we have an amazing record of the ancient atmosphere contained in the tiny bubbles in those ice cores. One recent example of abrupt climate change of a minor sort was this 4.2 kiloyear event, happened 4,200 years ago, in which some areas around the world were intensely dry and other areas intensely, unusually wet. And it is believed, because right at that same time, there were a couple of ancient civilizations that collapsed, and that this was the cause of that collapse. So just a little bit more about these tipping points, because it's something that I'm really interested in. These are the 5 main, there are others, but these are the 5 potential tipping elements or tipping points in the climate system. The loss of Arctic sea ice, which is happening very rapidly. Disruption of these Atlantic currents, the AMOC, or Atlantic, also called the Atlantic THC, the thermohaline current that brings warm water up to the northern Europe and all of Europe, and keeps it from getting much colder. Collapse of these two biggest ice sheets on the planet, the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets. Dieback of the 2 biggest forest systems in the world, the Amazon tropical forest and the boreal forest of the north across Alaska, Canada, the Nordic countries, Siberia. And the thawing of Arctic permafrost, which is happening, and it's emitting a lot of, we haven't reached methane and also CO2, and also potentially releasing ancient pathogens that could be very dangerous to life on Earth and to humans today. This is my last slide about climate tipping points. And I really like, this is a great paper by Lenton et al. 2019 on climate tipping points, published in Nature. And not only do they show these various tipping points and 1 or 2 others, but the arrows show the connections between these. And you see that the Arctic sea ice up at the middle top there, as that it's an albedo effect, the darker the ice is white and it reflects back sunlight. When there's no ice, it absorbs more heat, is a positive reinforcement. And that affects at least 4 of the other tipping points directly or indirectly, more if you go indirectly with those arrows. So this is a paper, if you're interested in tipping points, even though it's 6 or 7 years old now, it's a great one. It's not out of date. Moving on to the next category of wildcards. On the horizon, wildcards are significantly less likely to be detected in advance. it's easy to find those, to in advance detect those in plain sight wildcards. But with on the horizon, the experts rarely see them coming. There are no early warning signals, or if there are some warning signals, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. They're buried in this low signal to noise ratio, but they may be discernible, detectable in advance through a combination of imagination, innovative methods, and specialized knowledge. And I'll talk more about, strategies for dealing with this type of wild card in the next section of my talk. But here's an example of an on the horizon wild card, this Great Recession that occurred just not long ago. It really wasn't so great because it had devastating impacts, but it was a severe downturn due to the popping of the U.S. housing bubble. And the surprising thing is that the experts missed it. Economists have mountains of data and spend their lifetimes studying economies, and almost no one saw it coming. The people that did, I really think that the few who did see it coming and predicted it were the Dr. Doom economists that are always predicting recession. And so there are some like that. The impacts, of course, were widespread. These are some of the direct impacts, but then the long-term indirect impacts as well. If you know any young people who were just graduating from college in 2007, 2008, 2009, their economic prospects were really affected by this. And it had all kinds of implications on everything from consumption to demographics and birth rates and so on. Here's an interesting past example of an on the horizon wild card, and it's a controversial one sometimes, the Pearl Harbor surprise attack. In fact, President Trump just mentioned Pearl Harbor in front of the Japanese Prime Minister yesterday. But the experts missed this. The military intelligence officers that were supposed to be watching and were watching did not see it coming. In hindsight, then some of the weak signals that suggested this could be plausible start to appear. They are generally not in sight beforehand, but afterwards, same with the 9/11 attacks. These weak signals, we start to wonder, well, why didn't the experts see this coming? It seems so obvious now. But in advance, it's not so obvious because, again, the signal's buried in low signal to noise ratio. So I'm going to come back to Pearl Harbor in the next section when I talk about strategies for dealing with this type of wild card. Here's another example of a on the horizon wild card that you may not have thought of. Maybe you have. Silent Spring, and the publication of that book in 1962 by this unlikely author, Rachel Carson. It had huge impact. The classic that launched the environmental movement, it says at the top of this edition. And here's some quotations from the introduction to this edition of Silent Spring. It touched off a national debate on chemical pesticides and the limits of technological progress. It resulted in a ban on domestic production of DDT, brought all kinds of the grassroots environmental movement to the forefront and sparked that movement, and brought all kinds of regulation at the state and federal level, and initiated a transformation in the relationship between humans and the natural world, at least for many of us. This was a turning point. It was a book that I read when I was in high school because it was on my father's bookshelf, even though it was, from 10 years earlier at that time. So that's it for examples. Now on to this third type of wild card over the horizon. These are ones that are not detectable in advance. They are beyond the realm of our experience. They're something brand new. They defy advanced detection by the smartest, most creative people, the best techniques. There are lots of different names for these. Sometimes black swans is used because it seems in the book Black Swans, which I'll show you in a minute, this is the way he's defining them, something that is beyond the realm of our experience. But there are other terms: out of the blue surprises, unknown unknowns, unknowable unknowns. And here's the book. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Amazing guy. He's written a number of really interesting books. This is one of them. And in the book, he gives some examples of black swan events, which I don't think are really over the horizon wild cards. Well, some of them might be. The rise of the internet and the personal computer, he gives us examples. Actually, if no one else, science fiction writers have been writing about these things for ages, for 100 years, for many decades at least, and others. Probably Earl Joseph was talking about these things back in the early days of this group of Minnesota Futurists. World War I, maybe that is a good example of a over the horizon wild card, because it was sparked in such a random way by this assassination, chance encounter by this Archduke, and then it spiraled out of control. And it was the first World War. We'd never had a World War before. So in that sense, it's something brand new and not that the Earth had experienced before. Dissolution of the Soviet Union, I'm not sure about that one. We can talk about that later. But here's a hypothetical example of an out of the blue, over the horizon wild card. A system, any system, crosses some threshold or tipping point that was previously unknown. And then the system behaves in a whole new and unforeseen way. Okay, that's very general. I searched and I racked my brain trying to think of a more concrete example. This is the only one that I came up with, and it's a scary one. It's if two colliding neutron stars that are many light years away from Earth could create an explosion that's so powerful that it would wipe out life on Earth. Now, that is a devastating over the horizon, out of the blue wild card. Maybe it's no longer that type of wild card anymore, because astrophysicists now know about this possibility, as extremely remote as it is. And here's a threat assessment of a kilonova event. So now that we know about it, or now that experts like astrophysicists know about it, maybe it's no longer an over the horizon wild card. Or from that article that this talk is based on, I had a couple of tables. Here's some past wild cards. I've talked about a couple of these: Pearl Harbor, Silent Spring. Others, the pandemic influenza is the one from just after World War I, not the recent one that we lived through. But these are all past wild cards with different domains of origin. And if you're interested in those, there's references that you can find in my paper related to each of these. Some possible future wild cards. So this table looks the same, but these are future wild cards. We know that a super volcano eruption in Yellowstone is possible. It's happened before. Radical extension of the human lifespan. Certainly the development of artificial general intelligence or artificial super intelligence would be an in plain sight wild card, because people are working on these things, are aware of it. Abrupt climate change is the one that I'm most interested in as someone who works in the environment and natural resources. But all of these are potentially very significant future wildcards. Are you familiar with Thucydides' trap, the one at the bottom there? It's this ancient Greek historian Thucydides who observed related to the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. And Sparta, that war was driven in part by Sparta's concern about Athens' rapid rise. And so a modern day political scientist, Graham Allison, looked at these types of situations throughout history, and he looked at 16 historical cases where there was a dominant power and another power rose and potentially threatened it. In 12 of those 16 cases, war broke out. And so he applied that to the modern case between China as a rising power and the United States, and published a book with a scary title of Destined for War. But that's Thucydides' trap. Moving on to strategies for anticipating and dealing with potential wildcards. The strategies for in plain sight wildcards include various systems to identify, assess, and monitor this type of wildcards, because we know they're a possibility. We don't know when they're coming, but we know they're a possibility. And this, I think, is a really good example of that. The Near Earth Object Surveyor Space Telescope that NASA has, it hunts for asteroids and comets that could be hazards, that could hit the Earth. And it's basically a planetary defense system against a wildcard event. I'm glad it's there. I hope it's still well funded. Let's keep our fingers crossed. There's been a lot of budget cuts at NASA. Various types of horizon scanning systems that are focused on in plain sight wildcards could also be used. There are wildcard clearinghouses like the one at the University of Cambridge and their Center for the Study of Existential Risk. There are expert-based approaches, including in-depth interviews with experts, focus groups, Delphi panels, various brainstorming techniques. And so there are strategies, there are ways of dealing with these because we know about them, the in plain sight wildcards. Now, for on the horizon wildcards, it's a little different because the experts are not much help here. And so the use of imagination and creativity to identify them, I think, is critical. One way to do that is through games, serious games. In the military, for hundreds of years, wargaming has been used, of various types of wargaming. It's changed since the early days, but it's a useful technique to explore potential wildcards. And in Finland, Finland is such a forward-looking country. They are way ahead of us in terms of futures thinking and futures education and futures literacy. I was over there a couple of years ago, and I was just amazed and impressed by their the futures literacy in Finland. They sponsored a national wildcard creative writing competition. So basically crowdsourcing wildcard thinking and identification. There's a paper published about this I could share with you. They offered prizes, pretty nice prizes for the winning. There was a panel of judges that judged the entries, and they published a book of the top creative writing entries related to wildcards. I think that was a really creative way to try and identify on the horizon wildcards. There's also the possibility of, instead of talking to the experts, talk to really creative people. And science fiction writers are the obvious ones, because there have been, going back to to who wrote The Invisible Man and the Time Machine, and
H.G.
War-
Wells.
H.G. Wells. Thank you. Couldn't think of his name. So many interesting developments that H.G. Wells and other science fiction writers over the decades have seen before anyone else, seen in their imagination and written about, thankfully, before anyone else did. Serious games are another way to think about and get people thinking and maybe identifying on the horizon wild cards. This is a game that I developed with some colleagues of mine, and it's not intended to identify on the horizon wildcards, but the gameplay includes wildcards that we identified through our horizon scanning project. And so the players involved in this are exposed to wildcard thinking and specific wildcards, and they start thinking about the implications of them. That's not the sole focus of the game, but if you're interested in this game, let me know. I can share we have a version of it that you can print and play. It's a lot of printing, but and then there's a paper that I'm happy to share with you as well, because I worked in research. It's publish or perish, and so we publish papers about everything we do. Nothing goes unpublished. This was published in the Journal of Forestry, and with my 3 colleagues that worked on this. The 9/11 attacks was an on-the-horizon wildcard event, and in looking back at what went wrong with that, the 9/11 Commission report charged the U.S. intelligence agencies with a failure of imagination, and this is very, very common in this type of event. So again, the importance of imagination and avoiding that failure of imagination. Going back to the Pearl Harbor attack and the possible role that imagination could have played. In hindsight, there were some weak signals, and I mentioned wargaming is this long-standing technique. In 1940, more than a year before the Pearl Harbor attack, there was a military intelligence officer who would then become a general in the future, Matthew Ridgway, who wrote a war game scenario exactly about a surprise attack on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. It was never played because his fellow officers thought it was too ridiculous. It was too implausible. Failure of imagination right there. If they had played that, it's possible that we could have been much better prepared for that attack if it was followed through on. So, and there's an interest there. This has been written up in a number of places, including this paper by Lempert in the Fukuyama book on wildcards. So this brings us to strategies for dealing with these very tough over-the-horizon wildcards. Is there any way to deal with them? There's no advanced warning of them. How can you develop a strategy to deal with them? And the answer is you can't. All you can do is, Peter, are you joining us? It looks like, is that Peter, Peter Bishop, or am I seeing someone else there?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. It looked like Peter. So the only strategy for dealing with these this type of wild card, I believe, is to build general resilience into our systems, all types of systems, organizations, and into our personal lives as well. General resilience is defined as the capacity of systems to absorb unanticipated impacts or disturbance. There's a whole transdisciplinary field of resilience science. There's a lot of resilience thinking that has been carried out by environmental scientists, particularly at the University of British Columbia, but elsewhere. And so that's a potential. One tool that might be useful here is resilience dashboards that can be used to monitor resilience. And I'll give you an example of that. The European Commission actually developed some resilience dashboards. If you search for European Commission resilience dashboards, you'll find them. It was something that was proposed by some futurists in a 2020 strategic foresight report. And these resilience dashboards include a broad set of indicators covering 4 different dimensions: social and economic, environmental, digital, and geopolitical. They include indicators that show both capacities to deal with future shocks and vulnerabilities, that areas that are in need of improvement. And so, and these indicators were based on some analysis of potential megatrends that could really drive change in Europe's, affecting Europe's future. So I think this is a promising approach. It's also a lot of work and a lot of money to set it up and really do it right. So I'm curious to go back to this now. It's been a while since I've looked at these EU resilience dashboards, but to see if they're being kept up and to see how, I wonder if there's an analysis that shows how useful, if at all, they have been. Because these over-the-horizon wildcards are really the tricky ones that we need to look out for. A final concluding thought. We have lots and lots of time for questions because I moved through these slides pretty fast. But my concluding thought is this, that the frequency of disruptive wildcards of all types, the 3 different categories, and their power to shape and disrupt the future, to disrupt entire systems, to change paradigms, suggests the critical importance of including them in planning, policy management at all levels in order to minimize the consequences and of being unprepared. That's my take-home message, I guess. And this is my email address, bengs001@umn.edu. If you'd like to follow up with me one-on-one, I'm happy to, that would be great. And I'm going to stop sharing here and open up the discussion. David, do you want to handle the questions or should I?
I can certainly call on people if you'd like me to.
Yeah, would you please? Thanks.
Dean?
Oh, you're muted, Dean.
I'm muted on purpose. Yeah, I can save that graphic. Did you post your email address in the chat? Yes or no?
No, I did not. But if you go, I did post my website, and that website has all my contact
I got it. I
information.
already, your website is already in my favorites. All right.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Any any,
Yeah. It was a great presentation, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Something I never see mentioned in this is, how can I say this? The exponent of the rate of change that's formed from the number of people. The more people we have, the more wild ideas are going to come out, and the more likely it is that one of them will get picked up.
And thus creating a wild card event.
That just is,
Hmm.
in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
We get more and more change faster and faster because of how many people we have trying to be creative.
Right, and causing unanticipated consequences with their creativity and their activities and so forth. And
Yeah.
that is a really good point. I had not really thought about that more people, more wild cards, but I think it makes a lot of sense because humans are the origin of wild cards. Climate change and the possibility of abrupt climate change, that is anthropogenic in nature. Climate has changed throughout all history before humans, but what we're experiencing now is on a different scale, and it's definitely driven by human actions and burning stuff, basically. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Warren.
Yeah, thanks for this. It's kind of fun. Several years ago, my wife and I thought about the necessity for in the stock market to lay out possible scenarios that could have an impact. You mentioned imagination. What we would be doing is trying to imagine what could possibly happen. I can imagine, could we have imagined, for example, what's going on in Iran right now?
Of course.
And that could have huge impacts on people's lives, their wealth. And so how would you suggest organizing your imaginations to be productive in a scenario like that, where you're trying to put together, instead of how do you eliminate some of the crazies? And when the crazy of attacking Pearl Harbor was considered a crazy, how do you sort those? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, good question. I don't know if there's a good answer to that, but I'll give it a shot here. One thing that I worked a number of years ago with several futurists at the Institute for Alternative Futures, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was around for many decades, and it was one of the leading futures consultancies. They had a for-profit and a nonprofit side to them. They worked with companies and they worked with public agencies, including the Forest Service. We worked on them with several projects. And their president at the time I was working with them was a guy named Jonathan Peck, a brilliant futurist, and he had a long career in futures working with all kinds of different groups. And he told me that the most difficult part of his job was always getting groups and individuals to think about a broader range of possibilities. And that's what I think you're talking about with imagination, is how do you get people to, just like with this Matthew Ridgway, the military officer who proposed the wargaming, a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, it was dismissed because it was too improbable. That could never happen. And how do you get people to be willing to think outside the box, to think about a broader range of possible, plausible, and preferable futures? And I think that's the central challenge of future studies. Some of the ways that I have been exposed to and that I've tried over the past 15 years since I've shifted my research into futures research, have been, there are a number of exercises that, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with the futures wheel.
Yeah.
And also Well, and maybe you've heard Joel Barker talk about the implications wheel, which is his version of it, which I think is a real improvement on the original futures wheel. It's a way to explore a wide range of direct and indirect cascading impacts of some change. And so it's a brainstorming, a structured sort of brainstorming approach. And you do it with diverse groups of people. By having diversity in these groups, you get much better results because you have less groupthink. And diversity in all respects, diversity in the disciplinary backgrounds of the individuals, their life experiences, their all aspects of diversity. And I've found that when I've done implications wheel exercises with different groups related to changes related to forestry and natural resources. And we did a bunch of these, and we published them, publish or perish. And so if you're interested in those, that's one tool that can be used to get people thinking about what could happen and being more creative, because it's a brainstorming approach. There are lots of others as well. And it's one of the I mentioned this book project that I'm working on. It's one of the things that I hope to do in this book. There's the two parts to the book. First is principles for thinking about the future, and the second part is strategies for developing foresight. But a big part of those strategies are a use of imagination and creativity. And yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you, but
great.
I can.
It's a difficult thing to do, and you know, we could you could go spend a lot of time thinking about things that'll never happen.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting. So you might be familiar with at the University of Hawaii, they have, it's sort of petered out now, but a futures doctoral program headed up by Professor Jim Dater. I just had an email exchange with Jim Dater yesterday because I was asking how bad he's still in Hawaii, how bad was the flooding and the storms there? And he said it's the worst that he's ever experienced. But Jim Dater, probably the leading academic futurist in the world, has a couple of futures, Dater's laws, he calls them. And the Dater's second law is that any useful idea about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And that's, you know, if people don't say, oh, that could never happen, you're not thinking creatively enough about what could happen. So
that's interesting. All right. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. Dean, are you next?
I am
Dean.
next. Yeah, I just want to quickly, hopefully we'll have time to circle back to RLE, radical life extension, and the implications of, but I was reacting to Warren when he said, so I'm using my imagination, and then how do I categorize, rationalize imagination? Well, when you put it on note cards, it's not imagination anymore. You know, that's my gut feeling. In other words, if you try to rationalize, you know, the great science fiction writers probably resisted that. They probably wrote a lot of stuff that when they reread it, it was utter nonsense. And, you know, so, you know, I think it's a bit like finding the needle in the haystack, but you were trying to apply that to the stock market. And I used to be a trader back in the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns and the unknowable unknown unknowables. And yeah, imagination. And I don't buy the term think outside the box. I don't acknowledge the existence of a box.
yeah, that's good.
My thought is there's a feature that came along in 2007 called the iPhone, which I think was a major disruption in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Not only do you have the ability to fact check Google information on a whim, just immediately. The most common expression I have heard recently is just Google it. You don't have to ask anybody any questions. You can increase isolation, but I think the most interesting thing about it is that everyone now with a cell phone, with a smartphone, has become a amateur video journalist.
Not just amateur. They make six figures.
And
Come on.
if you saw, for example, the ICE raid in Minneapolis and how many phones were being used for documenting that, and how the government might want to say that this was something A, but we knew that something B and C were really correct because there were so many iPhones on that situation. The ability to use video evidence as a way of making a point that can't be controverted by some authority. That I think is very, very important. There are just a lot of features about the iPhone has become the new desktop essentially, or the smartphone. I shouldn't say iPhone because that's the iPhone and the Android phones have become the new desktop. And until we get to glasses or to some other version of, which is kind of coming on slowly, I think it's a major vector of change that will never go back.
Failure of imagination.
Perpetual problem of the human mind.
Mhm.
I have four things here. The first is that we have been at war with radical Islam since the revolution.
Here we go again.
That's where the Marine Corps got their reputation. Way back when.
Semper Fi.
They have been very good at thinking outside the box. Who would think to destroy 1,000-foot tall carvings on a mountain? Because they didn't want that religion for some reason. The problem is not thinking outside the box. That's easy. The problem is thinking just enough outside the box that you can get there. Way, way out there, yeah, that's easy to think about. What's the step that's outside the box that you can get somewhere? And the last thing is, this is something I just noticed. You have a piece of the world's largest supercomputer in your pocket. If all of the cell phones were linked, some hostile app came along and started stealing cycles, probably while you were asleep, that would be the biggest, fastest supercomputer in the world.
Today.
By orders of magnitude. Now that's something no one is looking at as a target. I
Are
hope
you
someone is.
No, I
I
think
hope
they are,
someone
but-
is.
I hope they are.
I hope they are too. And you know, if I can just interject for a second
Sure.
on that point, is one thing I'm encouraged about is that every single one of the U.S. intelligence agencies has some foresight or futures or strategic foresight capabilities. They have units that do that kind of work, and hopefully they're thinking about a wide range of possibilities. I mentioned that game that we developed, that board game, and it was actually played by the Futures group in the Secret Service. They have a small Futures group there, people who are, instead of the day-to-day stuff that the Secret Service does, their charge is to think about the longer range, much broader possibilities related to their mission. And they played that game and got some positive feedback from them on it. And so, anyway, my point is that all of the intelligence agencies and every branch of the military also has futures. That's really, in the US, that's where futures thinking and future studies came out of, was the military. And the Marine Corps has a really outstanding futures group, and they used to publish their horizon, or a version of their horizon scanning, every month. And they had several projects with science fiction writers. So which is really not what you'd expect from the Marine Corps, at least not what I'd expect. But that's encouraging. I think that I hope there are people in high places in intelligence agencies and in the military that are thinking about those possibilities that you mentioned.
David.
There's so many different things that we've touched on. And we can argue, it probably isn't useful, but we could argue about the examples and which of the three bins that you were talking about. Are they really beyond the horizon, or are they on the horizon, or are they obvious? One of your examples, the economic of the problems in 2007, 8, and 9 may have been actually caused by a change in the categorization. They changed the accounting rules, and then they changed them back again, and the problem went away. But it took us almost 5 years to recover just the stock market, to recover what they had lost in that recession. What I was thinking might be worth thinking about in terms of a systems perspective is, what are the incentives for different human groups? It's relatively easy to see what the advantage to Japan was of the Pearl Harbor attack. And as you say, it had been envisioned. It was not an unknown unknown. Somebody thought about it and said, would this make a good war game? And it would have made an excellent war game had the powers that had the control of considered it. So totally off the wall, unbelievable possibilities are absolutely worth thinking about. And especially if you can see a group for whom it would represent a potential positive. And in talking about asymmetric warfare, clearly your example of the United States and China, there's a book from the Chinese perspective. The 100-Year Marathon, I think, is the title. But the potential benefit to China of minimizing the recognition on the part of the United States that they are a potential competitor.
Hmm.
It's fairly clear that since Nixon essentially brought them into the world as we know it, if you look at their position in world trade previous to 1970, 72 was it maybe that Nixon went to China?
I think so.
But after that, they have been able to become the world's manufacturing low-cost producer in many different fields. You could almost say across the board, but not quite. But clearly, if they were not able to manufacture products at lower cost, a lot of things would be different. And the incentives for them to continue well, they basically have taken 1 billion people in the world out of poverty in the last 50 years. And that's unprecedented. It's precedented in that South Korea did a similar thing. Japan did a similar thing. The United States actually did a similar thing back in the early 1800s when we implemented manufacturing as opposed to growing cotton. Our transition from farmers to factory workers. The whole consideration of using energy to do jobs that we wanted to accomplish. We use energy in this country as if we had something equivalent to 6,000 slaves apiece. Why wouldn't anybody else in the world want to do that if they could? And clearly, they do. We use something like 20 watts to think. And so we're a lot slower, but we're a lot more energy efficient than most of our devices even yet. And it's interesting to think, what will the next supercomputers look like that are implemented? Could they be a combination of mechanical, optical, and biological at a much lower energy level? What would be the incentives for someone to do that? Well, we are concerned about large language models changing our total economy, and that's very definitely going to happen. But the things that we've seen in the past, it's intriguing to talk about robots as automation and a human form robot as a bartender, for example. But the cost benefit to replacing that bartender with a pop machine, for example, or another type of targeted automation as opposed to general automation is going to be a cost savings. So it's not at all clear that the labor disruption is going to go the way we're worried about. If that example makes any sense to people. If Tesla were to implement all of their Optimus robots in place of humans, that would certainly save them money. But the next step beyond that is a specialized machine that does bits and pieces of those jobs more effectively and at a lower energy cost. So it's not clear that human robots are the end point of automation in that respect. Specialized tools that do particular jobs that come up, like their mega presses that form aluminum castings for the whole front end and the whole back end, and then the battery as the connector between the two that minimize parts, except for the resilience of trying to repair those castings. It's not clear that there isn't some design requirement to make their cars more resilient in repairable in crashes. But that's a whole nother issue. The point I wanted to bring up was, if you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes, if you can imagine their incentives, some of these unknown unknowns become very obvious. There's a significant advantage to disrupting elections in the United States from the point of view of Chinese trade. There's been talk about, well, Trump's trade taxes,
Tariffs, yeah.
tariffs, making it much more expensive to implement solar photovoltaic panels in the United States manufactured in China. On the other hand, the cost benefits are such that China is selling photovoltaic panels worldwide, and some nations at this point are getting half of their energy, electric production, from solar photovoltaic. I'm not sure if it's Bangladesh, but I read recently that somebody is up over 50%.
Afghanistan.
Thank you. And has done that at a cost significantly less than implementing coal-burning power plants, which were the cheapest only 20 years ago.
Yeah.
In
Yeah,
that
it's one of the, I'm sorry.
No, in that sense, the price decrease for photovoltaic panels has been one of your disruptions.
Oh, yeah. It's huge.
It's absolutely huge.
It's and it has huge geopolitical consequences for the future as well. We wouldn't be fighting a war in the Middle East right now if because you don't have to ship solar energy is not something you dig out of the ground and ship around the world. I had a guest speaker in my class a few weeks ago, an economist, Jay Coggins, and this was his focus, talking about the solar, wind, and batteries revolution, and how astounding and how surprising it was that 10 years ago, people working in this field did not see that continued drop dramatic drop in the cost of renewables. And in a period of 20 years, going from solar and wind, going from the most expensive form of energy to the least expensive in 20 years, it's absolutely earth-shaking. And that, I think, is one of the bright spots for our climate crisis. Not that it's going to solve it completely, because it's such a big problem, but it is a huge spot of optimism for the future. The revolution. And I have to tell you, personally, I'm so happy. It's so great to we have solar panels on our place in Duluth, and we split our time between Minneapolis and Duluth. Because we're not there full time, we have negative electrical bills. And so at the end of the year, we'll get paid by the power company for, if at the end of the year we're still, they still owe us money.
Yeah. Well, but it was not an unknown unknown. Tony Seba wrote a book in 2010 predicting the kinds of price reductions we've seen. He has an excellent track record in that respect.
Yeah.
Let's see. Stan, are you next, or is Dean? Dean, you're muted.
I see Dean being ahead of me.
Dean is next. I've been next for a while. And by the way, I want to see a podcast called David and Dave, or Dave and David. You guys going back and forth. My God, you opened so many cans of delicious sardines for me. Where do I begin? So yeah, I had negative. I got, typically my brother and I got between $300 to $800 per year rebate from San Diego Gas and Electric, and we have the highest electric rates shared with Honolulu. And then along came EVs, so we're no longer negative, right? Because what's a gas station, you know? And you know, I charge my car, and all of our solar panels, which my brother and I put up by ourselves from a kit, saved about $10,000-$15,000, and they are all made in the USA. But that was then, and this is now. But yeah, we bought from a company that guaranteed US-made solar panels. I think they were 350s at the time. They'd probably be 450s today. If I'd known the unknowable, and I argue with my brother, I said, well, let's at least while we're in our 60s and can crawl around on a roof safely, let's put the racks up for another. I wanted 10 to 12,000, and my brother talked me down to 5,800 or whatever, which was enough to. But then we started installing electric hot water, right? Yeah, and got off gas, because we pay 4 times the national average for natural gas in San Diego. It doubles, quadruples when it goes over the Rocky Mountains. And but yeah, had I known the unknowables, we would have probably got more panels. But the whole idea that China on their own became the center of manufacturing. Well, if you use slave labor, Uyghurs, etc., you know, they built the pyramids with slave labor, right? Over generations.
Apparently, that's not true either. But
I know that's a bit of a, yeah. Actually, those are pretty good paying blue collar jobs. I've come to understand, but anyway, that decision to move all manufacturing to China, which had an unlimited labor force. Hear me out. I heard you out. And was a decision by U.S. consumers. We wanted $100 TVs. We didn't want the first TV my father drug home in 1952. He'd been saving. He worked for, I think, Honeywell at the time, and he was saving up money. And he came in with this TV. And in today's dollars, that little 13-inch TV was $5,000. Now we want a OLED 4K Ultra for $120 from, and so that is our consumer greed driven. In other words, we are not willing to pay the price for the consumer goods that we wish to consume, whether that be cars, technology. And then the other quick point, because I see Stan has got his hand up, is, I wrote my first code in Minnetonka High in 1964, I think, a Fortran program. And so I've been a techie since day one.
Sorry, did you go to Minnetonka High?
I graduated class of 65.
Wow.
We won the state basketball. The
Go
Minnetonka
Skippers.
Those Skippers.
I was class of 74.
Oh, well, you're a kid, yeah. And Mike Lord was in my class. You maybe heard the name, but yeah, we the Skippers, who were pathetic in athletics, right?
Yeah.
We could maybe beat Wyzetta on a good day, right? and we got some California imports, right? California movebacks. A kid that was born in Minnesota moved to California, said, "Screw California, I'm moving back." Anyway, we won the 1965 state basketball championship, and I was in the band. And God, that's a memory.
Yeah,
that is a memory. I had one more thing, but I'm already forgetting. So, yeah, it's the anyway. Since I've been a techie and on the internet, and I was on the internet before the internet. I'm AOL founding member. I'm Prodigy. I'm you name them. 300 baud, 1200 baud, Hayes modems, and all that. And I believed in the myth of the democratization of the internet. I don't see, and it's all caused by the internet, or much of it. I see the opposite of democratization. I see radicalism, fundamentalism, viralism, and this whole idea is nothing is real until it goes viral on TikTok. Well, viral is a bad word to me. You see, it is not as democratizing as we would like to think. It is and it isn't. But that's the internet we have today, mostly due to my hero, my anti-hero, Steve Jobs. And I'm going to meet him in purgatory or hell, whichever. I'll find him, and we will have a conversation. All right, Stan.
Actually, I'm going to also talk about Steve Jobs a little bit, but with the discussion about China and their rapid industrialization from the 70s into the 2000s, it was helped along nicely by Apple, because Apple is pouring $11 billion into the Chinese economy yearly. And they're not giving them the cutting edge kind of tech to do nanometer style photography, lithography, or whatever, TSMC or ASML type stuff, but they're giving them the finances to do the busy work of industrial technology. assembly lines and that kind of thing. That's why they've been able to grow so rapidly. And the ideas of what Musk has been doing with the gigapresses, David, they're not mega presses, they're gigapresses that create the front and the rear and then the battery in the middle of the vehicles. And the other thing I wanted to say about China that I've learned from another source, which is a Chinese fellow that talks about if you want to do business with China, he gives you all these inside information. Apparently, China's communities or their towns are specializations of making specific products.
Yep.
So if you want washing machines, there's this one town that does all the washing machines. The supply lines are all right there to do washing machines. This other town does large scale TVs. This other town does whatever. They're basically towns become concentrated implementers and suppliers for
If I can interrupt, they are essentially termite mounds, beehives, anthills with specialization that becomes a group intelligence, very productive. Ants and aphids are smarter than we are collectively, and that's the Chinese model. If you have a billion ants who are bipeds, yeah, you can do that exactly. But that is only done in a state-controlled economy.
Plus, they also have lots of engineers.
Well,
Lots
yeah,
of
because we educated them. You remember 5 years ago?
Excuse me,
Hang on, China
Dean,
graduated
you
more
cut in the
engineers.
first place,
All right,
and they're
all right. You got your
Yeah.
hand up. I will mute.
Thanks. Just raise your hand and get in line with the rest of us. Had you finished your
You
point,
guys can
Sam?
all have repartee, but I'm not allowed to.
You take more than your share already.
He just closed up.
He's gone.
He'll be back or
Come
not.
on, Dane.
And because now I've lost my train of thought. What else is new? It'll probably come back also. It's really complicated. These discussions are not trivial, and the figuring out what the cause and effect is not trivial, especially when we're talking about complex systems. And anytime you've got people involved, you're talking about complex systems. The motivations are not trivial. Doug, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Dave what his thoughts are. I've been seeing and reading some stuff about great nations that have come and gone. And one of the examples they were using was how Spain, controlled things all over the world. Then England controlled things all over the world. Then the Russians did that, and now the United States is doing that. And the predictions were that there's like 7 major elements that decide how long a nation will control. And according to this group, there's 5 of those already in effect for the United States. One is spreading out your military all over the world. One of the other ones is printing your own money and stuff. Where do you see the U.S. going down that path?
Wait, sorry, going down the path to collapse?
Yeah,
is that what,
yeah.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature. And so I try to look for the positive and the negative signals of change. And it's important to pay attention to both. But But certainly, you know, there's a number of books on this very topic looking throughout history, like the book Collapse by Jared Diamond. And what are some of the other ones? Well, one of my former Forest Service colleagues, he was a anthropologist with the Forest Service Research, Joe Tainter, wrote a book on the collapse of complex societies, which is a classic. He didn't last very long in Forest Service research because he went back to the academic world. But there are throughout history, great civilizations have come and gone. Great world powers have come and gone, and my gut tells me, this is totally unscientific, but my gut tells me that the American century was the 20th century, and the 21st century may be the Chinese century. And others have said that as well. But, you know, things can change, but we're not headed in the right direction right now. And China is one of the leaders in renewable. Obviously, we talked about this, you know, that
absolutely.
They made a decision a number of years ago, and it was characterized, I think, in a speech by the name of the Chinese premier is slipping my mind right now. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. To become an ecological civilization, for China to become that was a goal, and that was the beginning of their shift to going full-time into, or full force into renewables, was part of that. There are many other dimensions of it as well. And so the optimist in me would like to see my children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren live in a vibrant, strong society, and I hope that's the case. I also know that, I mean, and we all know this from people, I have a lot of colleagues and friends in Korea, in South Korea, and in Finland. And these are nations. Finland, for the 9th year in a row, has been the happiest, rated as the happiest nation in the world.
Yeah.
They're a little minor country, and people have a fantastic quality of life there. So if the American century is over, I don't know if it is. That doesn't mean we can't still be have wonderful, productive, happy lives.
All
That's
right.
my 2 cents.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
If someone would consider doing a presentation with us on the strengths that still reside in our system, that might make an interesting discussion topic. Tom, Tom.
That would be a difficult topic.
It's complicated.
I put my hand up because I see the note I made was collapse. I think we will collapse. No, I know that the United States will collapse. The question is, do we go over a cliff, or does the cliff just fall under us and we just kind of subside like a retreating wave? It's been great living at the top of the cliff.
Yep.
Sorry, you and the other lemmings.
Well, I didn't choose to be here. I mean, I came along and here I am, and
I'm a lemming.
Yeah, it's gonna go. I think we could turn it around, but that pretty much calls for a majority of Americans not to be human beings somehow. Better than human beings, maybe I should say.
Yeah, good point.
Anyway, Nick, David?
We
Or Dave?
supposedly have a nation of laws, and were we to actually implement them, there are some very interesting possibilities. As futurists, we talk about the wisdom of a crowd. As Republicans and Democrats, we don't necessarily realize that the crowd all needs to be voting, and we have to count all of those votes if we want to see where that wisdom comes down. We have the last 25 years of elections to look at, 26 years of elections to look at, and we sort of see that it's been a razor thin margin on each side, back and forth, back and forth. We've switched a number of times. But if we were to encourage everyone to vote, and if we were to make it economical by using ranked choice voting,
Oh,
potentially, okay, maybe you can show me how we could do better, H. Tom. I know you don't think much of voting.
no.
I don't think much of 50.0001% as being enough.
Or 49, David.
Well, 49 is even worse.
Yeah.
And having only 2/3 of our people willing to vote in a hotly contested election points to the fact that 1/3 of the people don't think they have any agency. And I've seen numbers that suggest that 90% of the voting districts in this country, it's not even possible. They're going to vote the way they voted before. As Tom Paxton said, our leaders are the best of men, and so we elect them again and again. Well, that's not really wisdom of the crowd. So until we get rid of gerrymandering, which is clearly electioneering, if you will, we don't have agency that we think we do. But
And
the
I
thing
have a question
but
on that point.
excuse me, Dean, the thing I'd like to get back to that I wrote down was paying real costs. Until we're willing to pay real costs, we're going to have these kinds of trade-offs that it's cheaper to buy it from China to modernize our electric system. We don't even have the capability of replacing some of the big transformers in our electric system in anything under a year or two of lead time. That's not very resilient. I'll quit at that point.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm muted. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'm sorry about my PTSD moment. I spent 2 years in combat in Vietnam. And every time a war breaks out, I can snap sometimes, but I'm okay now. I'm over it. I've learned to deal with it.
We'll let you back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. He who has the longest beard wins.
No.
Well, you do in the silverback gorilla world. Yeah, you are the silverback. But yeah, no, I mean, God, I mean gerrymandering. I mean here in California, blah blah blah, and there's it seems like two-party politics, and we have not always had two parties, by the way.
And they change over
And
time.
they change.
And we're going through another of those periods of time. I often read and quote Peter Zeihan, who says that the two-party system is a result of that first past the post 50.0001% is enough to control.
And, yeah, my hand is still up, but yeah, no, exactly. And we think that the blue-red Dem rep GOP, blah blah blah, is the norm. And the founding fathers, and I've studied the American Revolution, and ad infinitum, and the founding fathers did not envision, and many of them did not like the idea of a two-party system, us against them. Why should we be at war against ourselves? Why can't there be a middle ground? I'm all ears. What was his name? A Ralph Nader, or who was the guy that changed the election way back when? I'm all ears, and he had big ears. He was a third party.
Yeah.
I mean, you got Wallace, you got Perot, what was his name? I don't do names. He was the founder of ADC, a data company.
Yeah.
Ross Perot, thank you.
Ross Perot, there you go.
Yeah. But yeah, third party candidates are disruptive. And disruptive can be good, right? Disruptive can also steal the election away from the party whose blank you blank, right? And I don't belong to a political party, and I don't want to put myself blue or red. I'm a purple person, very much shading towards blue.
Yeah.
I used to call it I'm a bleeding heart libertarian.
Sounds right.
You are responsible for yourself, but we are all, it takes a village. We are all responsible for each other. That is the definition of society. It's hard to do a society when you're, what are we now, 380 million, whatever?
Mhm.
I don't even want to know the number. And
we have a system. We have a system of laws, and sometimes we even follow it. Churchill's quote that wasn't really his, we Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Well, maybe we might get there, but we're sure working on the everything else at the moment.
And I think I still have the floor for a few more minutes. Oh God, my mind, don't get 80 and see now. Yeah, we have laws. We have a constitution. How much of it is being followed in 2025, 2026? Powers Act. And now we want $200 billion to go make billionaires quadrillionaires, right? As in fight this, persecute this war and blah, 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 blah. And I get it. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. I know, and I know all about General Ridgway. And Stan loves a good conspiracy theory. There is a lot of evidence that FDR knew about that and believed it. He also believed that allowing or forcing, because we forced Japan's hand, we cut them off from oil. They were going to die. When you push somebody in the corner, they're going to lash back. And the Japanese ain't dumb, right? And but that was his. If without Pearl Harbor, well, I wouldn't exist. I'm a war baby. But we'd have to learn German to go to England now, probably, because we were so severely isolationist. Oh, well, now if you attack Pearl Harbor, which is, a bunch of ships and blah, 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 then we will have a reason to fight 2 world wars, essentially, and defeat Hitler and the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. And without Pearl Harbor, I don't even want to game theory the scenario of the world right now.
We
Okay.
probably would have gone into it later, as you say.
Maybe too later, but yeah, exactly. Yeah. But in other words, we had to build an appetite for war. And boy, did Pearl Harbor do that in one day.
And potentially Iran may build an appetite for peace.
Let's hope so.
You can't point to Iraq as having done that, but who knows? Maybe
No.
they know something I don't know.
And then
It
I'll
doesn't look good from this point.
then I'll shut up. But to H. Tom's point,
Promise.
or was it somebody's about Islam, right? And I've lost my train of thought. I'll raise
It'll
my
come back. Raise your hand again when it does, please.
sooner or later.
H. Tom?
Well, remembering to
Yes.
buy avocados yesterday did not come to my.
Okay.
Tom Trites.
For those of you in favor of ranked choice voting, I invite you to watch the current history of New York City, because there you see it demonstrated live. I've done 2 presentations to the Futurists about voting methods. And the only thing good, really, I can say about voting is that it's better than duels.
Mhm. We have the worst government anybody could imagine,
Except all the
for
rest.
all of the rest. Yeah.
Except all the others, yeah. If Minnesota has roughly 4,000 precincts and roughly 22,000 to 2,500 voters in each precinct, the fast, easy, accurate way to deal with that is for the people in each precinct to count their 2,500 ballots. They'll be up till 3 o'clock in the morning. And then they turn the results over to the Secretary of State, reserving the ballots in a box so they can be recounted if necessary. And then they go home. Now, if we have lots of things on the ballot, maybe the election judges should work until midnight or 1 a.m. and then come back in the morning and finish. No computer needed. No fancy, just you count the marks, and that's the total. You can have a stupid machine that
Oh, you're locked up.
Hopefully he'll come back.
Yeah. And Dave
It's Big Brother.
Bertram has been waving his hand. He's the host. He doesn't
You're the
need to
host,
wave his
Dave.
hand.
You
Yeah.
get to cut in. And you're
is
muted.
insane. You don't know that all the ballots will get there. You don't know that extra ones won't be pushed into the truck. You count them in the precinct and you send the results.
And then they double check that.
And then they can
I
they
worked
can
in
check
5
it any number
elections.
of times. So have I. Ranked choice is the gerrymandering, and his name is Gerrymander, not Gerrymander.
Right.
It has
A long
been
history.
around. It was around before he did it.
Exactly. And by the way, rank, look it up in MW, Merriam-Webster. It also means horrendously stinky.
Dean, Dave, you're
True.
muted, but you're our presenter, so
Yeah,
you
Yeah.
get to jump
thank you.
the line.
Sorry, I was just two things I wanted to mention. One about, politics and predictability. So this is sort of a general point when talking about voting and politics a little bit. And I mentioned Professor Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii, leading academic futurist in the world. And Jim, I asked him once, because we did a couple of projects with him in the Forest Service, one on wood-based nanomaterials, by the way, that's just an aside. But I asked him about predictability and politics, because by his PhD is in political science, and his futures program at the University of Hawaii was in the political science department. And he said, in his opinion, for a variety of reasons, politics was the least predictable of all the domains, like social, technological, economic, environmental. That politics was so unpredictable for some of the reasons you're talking about here that have been mentioned, but others as well. So that's the opinion of Jim Dater. The other thing is, I might have to leave in about 5 minutes because I'm speaking of the future of our democracy. We have a weekly Bridge Brigade protest across a pedestrian bridge in Northeast Minneapolis that I always go to, and when I'm in town, and that's happening soon. So I don't want to be too late for that. So I might cut out in about 5 minutes so I can hop on my bike and head over there.
Thank
But
you
it's
very much for coming.
Yeah,
been-
thank you.
Thank you.
Very good
Thank
presentation.
you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're very welcome. And I do have, partly from talks that I've given in the past on a variety of subjects, and from this environmental futures class that I teach at once a year at the university. I have a number of other topics, like every few months or so, if I'd be happy to come in as a guest speaker and on a topic that would hopefully be of interest to you.
Would you like to pick a date 2 months out and I'll just write you in?
Yeah. David always wants
Yes,
to-
please.
Yeah, I'll have to get my Smokey Bear pocket calendar out, and that's how old school I am. I still have a paper pocket calendar. But yeah, let's communicate by email, David, and we can figure out a date, because I have to look at which weekends we're in. Well, there's no reason I can't do it from Duluth. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're delighted to have you do that.
And-
We had one
Yes.
person sign up who said he'd come today from Atlanta, Georgia, but I haven't seen his name on our list. So I don't think he made it.
Yeah, real quick, Dave, why Duluth? The reason I went to Vietnam was Duluth.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, because I graduated from Minnetonka with, all my ACTs and everything off the map. But because I never did homework, my GPA wouldn't get me into the U of M. No, it got me into the U of M, but it got me into the U of M Duluth. So me and my buddy hopped on my 305 Honda Superhawk.
Yeah.
Drove up to
Nice.
Duluth. Yeah. And this is 1964, I'm going to say. And we went, oh my God, I've been to the North Shore, and I've been to, I said, this is freaking cold. And then, we came home, and that was my option. and probably I could have transferred into U of M. And then anyway, later on, another mutual friend of ours, I'm still a senior in high school, right? And he said, "So what are you doing after high school, Dean?" And I said, "Well, I've been accepted into U of M." He goes, "Great." And I said, "Duluth." And he said, "Not so great." and anyway, yeah, so it was a mutual friend that I interacted with, Eric Rehnquist, and he said, "What are you doing after high school?" I said, "Well, I don't know, Eric. What do I know? I'm 17, right?" And he said, "I went down and talked to the Marine Corps recruiter."
Ah,
And I said, "What the hell is a Marine Corps?" Because in Minneapolis, you joined the Navy because they had never seen an ocean before, right? And they would come back in their bell bottoms, and the girls would, fall on their knees and all that. And he said, "Marine Corps." I said, "Marine Corps." And anyway, yeah, it's a long story, but I ended up, and I yams who I yams, and I
Well,
love to be Spanish.
I think you should give Duluth another look, because there was this guy from Harvard who a few years ago proclaimed that Duluth was one of the most climate resilient cities in the nation.
Oh, I love Duluth.
Yeah, and the thing I love about it is, one of the things, it's an international port city in the
Yep.
middle of the continent.
Right.
You have these 1,000-foot ships coming in with all kinds
Everything.
of stuff. Yeah, these huge blades for wind turbines. And
Well, in my day, let me interrupt. It was iron ore from the
Yeah.
Rosapi Range going out of Duluth.
yeah. So anyway, if any of you are coming to Duluth on a weekend, there's a 50-50 chance that I'm there. And you got my email address if you want to come over for coffee. And then afterwards, we'll go out through our backyard and take a walk on Park Point, the 7-mile long sandy beach, and you'll feel like you're in Hawaii, but you're in
Oh
Minnesota.
my God, yeah.